Thank you for bearing with me. To those of you who were here yesterday, you might be hearing some of the same content. There's a little bit of overlap, but hopefully that'll help drive home those points. So let's consider for a moment how we've made decisions in animal advocacy in the past. We've often taken actions that make us feel good or make us feel validated. We have an important message and people don't seem to be listening, so we just want to get out there and shout it at them. We figure, if only they know, then they'd change their behavior, right? I mean, we did. Now, I'm not saying these methods are never appropriate. In fact, if they're strategically accompanying a campaign, they could be very appropriate and very effective. But the fact is, we don't know. And that in the past, when we've acted in this way, it hasn't always produced the results that we want. It therefore becomes clear the tremendous value of conducting research to understand what's most effective for every situation so that we can help as many animals as possible. That is why this conference is so important and why I'm so glad to be here today. We need this collaboration between academics and advocates to enable us to do the best possible job of our advocacy. Now, starting off, considering what we've been doing to help animals, we should consider what areas we've been helping animals in. Now, clearly, animals need our help in so many different ways, from animals used in research to companion animals to farm animals to wild animals. The list goes on. So while we want to help all of them, at some point we're going to have to ask ourselves, which area should we focus on? In fact, I've worked in every one of those areas over the last 12 years, and I've been asking myself that question constantly. Now, we certainly should continue helping every area, but we need to think critically about where we can do the most good, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So, when we decide which area we should prioritize, we consider three factors at Animal Charity Evaluators. We consider importance, so how many animals are involved? What is the scale of the problem? We consider neglect. How much attention is paid to the problem, and how much funding does that issue receive? And finally, tractability. How well do we understand the problem and its potential solutions? At any one point in time in the world, we have around 100 million animals used for research, 1 billion companion animals, 33 billion farmed animals, not including aquatic animals, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 trillion wild animals. As you can probably appreciate, it's pretty hard to estimate at that point. Now, every single one of these groups of animals is important, but as you can see, these last two categories have a particularly large number of animals, so that suggests we should prioritize some efforts on those. But let's look at those other factors. Of all the donations in the United States over 2014, only 3% went to help either animals or the environment. For simplicity's sake, let's say 1.5% went to help animals. Of that 1.5%, only 1% went to help farmed animals. 1%. And that's despite the fact that 99 out of every 100 animals that's killed or used in the United States is killed for food. Now, there's clearly a big discrepancy there, and there's clearly a big need. Think about that for a second. 0.015% is how much money we direct as a nation to help what is arguably the biggest source of man-made suffering in the world. Now, what about wild animals? We talked about wild animals. There's 10 trillion, give or take a couple trillion there, wild animals. Clearly, the numbers indicate we should care about that. Millions and millions of animals are suffering every day in the wild from disease, predation, starvation, and natural or not, it's still suffering, and we should care if we can find a way to help that issue. Unfortunately, that's where the problem lies with wild animals, in that we don't feel we have a good grasp of how to affect suffering on a large scale. And because of that, we view that farmed animal advocacy is the most impactful cause area. This is a subjective rating scale that the ACE staff compiled last year. As I mentioned, it's subjective, so this is our opinions, And if you'd like to, I would encourage you to make a chart yourself based on these 3 factors and rate these categories. But based on what we've decided here, you can see that farmed animals score highly in each of those factors, and that's why we believe that's the optimal cause area at this point in time. But what about these animals? Does that mean we shouldn't care about these kittens or your cats or your dogs or elephants or rhinos? Of course not. But it's important to use data to inform our work so that we can help as many individual animals, just like these individual kittens, just like individual chickens on a farm, individual piglets on a farm, as possible. At the very least, we should consider redistributing some of our efforts and our resources to help farmed animals. You could get the warm fuzzies, the good feeling you get when you help cats and dogs at your local shelter, and you could balance that with the utility you create by helping a more impactful area like farmed animals. Now, one common concern that people raise when we're talking about how important it is to support farmed animals is, well, you're taking all the money away from these other cause areas, and how are they going to survive? Because of course, those animals are important as well. The thing is, the numbers are not changing. Those charts, the number I just gave you, those all came from 2016. And we pulled that same data in 2014, just 2 years ago, and almost nothing has changed in that time. If we get to a point where we have 50, 60% of our resources going to farmed animal advocacy, absolutely, we need to reconsider our message, our approach, and the distribution of funds. But we're not even remotely close to that right now. Now, within farmed animal advocacy, we can use research to identify interventions or tactics that people commonly use to help animals and evaluate them to understand which are most impactful. Now, it's a very complicated process, and I'm not about to try to explain all that to you here today in my limited time. We do have detailed reports on our website if you're interested. But instead, I'm just going to touch on a couple interventions and explain how we think critically about how you can do more good to help animals within each one. First, let's consider grassroots outreach. Now, an easy example for people to understand of this would be handing out leaflets at a local college. Now, in some ways, this is very good. It's very easy to do, and it's very cheap. Leaflets don't cost very much money. You could simply take a break from your work at lunch, go hand out some leaflets, and raise awareness about a particular issue with the hopes of encouraging behavior change. And in fact, many advocates get involved with this, first involved with animal advocacy through this approach, because this is something that's easier to do, and people are often indoctrinated into the movement in this way. So there's a lot of value there, but there are also some important limitations. Essentially, what you're doing is individual outreach, and trying to change the world one individual at a time, trying to create systemic change is going to be difficult solely using this type of approach. So that's why it's important to pair this intervention with other interventions like corporate outreach campaigns. Now, corporate outreach campaigns would be when advocates pressure corporations to change their behavior, adopt better animal welfare standards, or perhaps remove animals from their products altogether. Now, this is systemic change. This is a way where you can affect millions of animals in one fell swoop, and it's really quite remarkable. Of course, there are limitations to this as well. You don't have the individual component. You need the public on your side to convince the corporations to do the changes in the first place. So in other words, for corporate outreach to succeed, you need the grassroots outreach to raise public awareness and get people on your side. So it's important to recognize that there are real advantages and limitations to both of these. And the same could be said for shelters or sanctuaries. So the number one thing that people say they're going to do to me when they say they want to help animals is they're going to set up a sanctuary. And it's great that they want to do something to help animals, and I don't want to diminish that. And in fact, there's real value to sanctuaries and shelters in that they directly save animals that need our help. They also serve as a valuable symbol to the public on how these animals should be in a natural setting, how they would normally look and act and feel. But there are very important limitations to that as well. In order to operate a sanctuary, you need to have medical care, you need to have food, you need to have shelter, you need to have staff costs. In short, it's incredibly expensive to raise animals for the duration of their life because, of course, in a sanctuary, they're not going to kill these animals prematurely, they're going to let them live out their lives. So there's an incredibly high cost per animal. Now, even that being said, shelter and sanctuaries can maximize their impact by doing more education programs, by setting up adoption programs. So there's ways that you can increase your impact as an advocate in all these different categories. One last thing I wanted to touch on real quick is something that many people are switching to, which is called earning to give. As you could see from my earlier charts, the movement is funding constrained, in particular farmed animal advocacy. So some people are going out, trying to get high-paying jobs, and then donating a large part of their salary to an effective animal advocacy group. Now, if you were able to go out and make $200,000 a year and donate half of that to a group, you could hire 2 people, which would be doing much more good than you would be able to do if you were to join that advocacy group yourself. Now, of course, not everybody is able to go out and get $200,000 a year jobs, $1 million a year jobs, but if you're one of those people that can, that's how you can make a real difference to help animals. Now, if you are doing any kind of research on any of these interventions, I did want to point out we've got a project that we created in collaboration with Faunalytics on our website called the Survey Guidelines Project. It's basically a bunch of pages with tips and resources so that you can conduct good outreach. Now, the reason I bring this up is because one of the worst things you can do is do bad research. Excuse me, I said outreach a second ago, research. So another thing that I commonly am contacted about is people saying that they want to evaluate their programs, and here's the survey they're going to use. And I look at that survey, and these are well-meaning people, and of course I encourage them, but that survey would tell them absolutely nothing about the impact of their program. So then they're going to go through all this effort and not only not learn something about their program, but they will actually potentially harm the impact of their program, because they might use misinformation from bad data to change the focus of their programs and thus accidentally cause less good to animals. And that's also why we've created the Animal Advocacy Research Fund. If you're interested in conducting research, please do check it out. We're giving away tens of thousands of dollars to individual advocates and academics who are willing to conduct quality research to evaluate their programs. Now, the last thing I really want to bring up here is a little example. Now that we've talked about some of the advantages, I think it's important to note some of the limitations. So I'm going to pick on Mercy for Animals for a second here. First of all, Mercy for Animals is a top charity of ACE. We think they do fantastic work, one of the best charities in the world. But here's an example where perhaps research was used too strongly. In 2013, Mercy for Animals put out a vegetarian starter guide. And using data, which is great that they collected data, on how the message resonated more with a young female audience, they created this vegetarian starter guide, which, as you see, has 3 young females on the cover, a young woman inside, and 6 female quotes from 6 female celebrities on the next page. Now, this might work very well for that target demographic. But what if you're a man and you come up to that table and you pick this up, you're interested in vegetarianism, and you see woman, 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 you open it up, you see woman, 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 woman. I mean, I think a lot of guys are going to put that down and say, maybe this wasn't for me. And I think the point here is that we need to use research to inform our work, but not dictate it. So if we completely go all in on any one thing that we decide is more effective, then we risk furthering the divide, furthering the lack of diversity of the movement, which is something that's incredibly important that is often ignored. Now, to MFA's credit, they did update their vegetarian starter guide soon after this, and I think it's much, much better. Again, I think they do fabulous work. But this is an example of something where, in my opinion, I think it would benefit from not completely adhering to the findings of research. So clearly, we need to think strategically about our approach. It's obvious that animal advocacy has been doing this over the last 10 years. Just looking at the freezer aisle in many of your grocers, you'll realize how much change has occurred over that period of time. We've had lots of successes, but we still got really far to go. And we need to ask ourselves, what are the best ways, or what are some new ways that we can help as many animals as possible? And that's ultimately what we're here to do today, to think outside the box. Because though we've had those notable successes over the last decade, we still have very far to go, and we want to get there as soon as possible. I hope you'll network with everyone here today, and together we'll discover the best ways to create real and meaningful change. Thank you.
Great, so thanks so much, John and Peter. Those were both amazing presentations. My name is JC. I'm a researcher and former chair of the board of directors at Animal Charity Evaluators. I'll be helping coordinate things today and do some speaker introductions. So to start off with, we're going to have a brief Q&A session for roughly 10-15 minutes. We're going to have 2 mics, which we have up here. Brittany will be helping me bring these to people who have questions. So we're going to set up.
No, I'm going to set it up. But
Okay. So I'll start doing Q&A while she sets things up on the computer. Do we have a first question? You get bonus points if you're brave. Okay, I'm going to start at the front. I think it's on.
Oh, okay. Thank you both for your talks. I just had a question. I'm rather new to EA, and I just was wondering how suffering is defined in terms of, the number of animals who are, quote, suffering, which of course they are, but for example, the damage that is done to dairy cows, how is that evaluated as suffering versus the physical pain that chickens are in a shed? I'm just curious about the type of what is considered suffering, whether it's psychological suffering or physical suffering, and how that is taken into account.
Yeah, I'll start that one off. It's a very good question. Suffering can be both physical and can be psychological. So I think there's no doubt at all that when you remove the newborn calf from the dairy cow, there is suffering, both for from the cow and the calf. And evidence from this is from the behaviour of both of them. But specifically, you can talk to any dairy farmer who's honest about it will tell you that, yes, the cow calls out for her calf. There's a little anecdote in, I think that Temple Grandin talks about in one of the things that she's written, or maybe it's the interview about the Anthropologist on Mars book that Oliver Sacks did, where she talks about a cow that would regularly pass the spot where the calf was removed, and not just for days or weeks, but even months after that, the cow would pause and call out for the calf. So I think there's no doubt that that's psychological suffering. The difficult question is how you compare it with the physical suffering, and that's a difficult question even for making comparisons within humans, right? How much do different people suffer from different kinds of things? There are attempts to find units for it. Kevin Wong was talking about this a bit yesterday, and he referred to the quality adjusted life year, which is a unit we get for humans when we're trying to assess the value of health interventions based on asking people questions and getting them to respond. We can't really do that with animals. So it's more difficult, and of course the fact that we're comparing also different species with possibly different capacities for suffer in different ways makes it even harder. So I don't think that we're close to being able to quantify that, but I think we can just say there is this kind of suffering where there seems to be evidence that that this is really significant suffering, major suffering, as it would be for a bird, a chicken obviously dying slowly of thirst, but clearly as it is for a cow whose calf is removed as well. And where that's not for some essential life-prolonging need for humans, and in neither of these cases is it, because we have alternative ways of feeding ourselves, then it's wrong, and then we should try to stop it.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that other than that's one of the great questions I think we have is how do you quantify suffering? I mean, one of the things we're very interested in and a project we've spent some time investigating is how do you quantify the differing suffering of different species? I mean, it's entirely possible that some species might suffer less, whether it's because of the number of neurons in their brain or something else that we don't understand. So I think it's a really interesting question, and there's absolutely psychological and physical suffering. I think we tend to focus more on the physical aspect just because it's more readily obvious to the public, but there's certainly deep psychological suffering going on as well.
Okay, great. So we're going to alternate questions on this side and this side. And if you'd like to briefly introduce yourself, you're welcome to do so. So this is Christy from the Good Food Institute. And just so you know, Brittany from Princeton is helping us out. And Tony is another researcher. She's going to be the other one with the mic for now. So do we have a question on that side of the audience, maybe near Tony next? Come on.
Thanks. So I'm Thomas from Animal Equality NGO, working for animals, and I was wondering, John, if you, an animal charge evaluator, will consider other metrics than the impact on animals, saved life, or suffering as metrics. You spoke about movement building yesterday, or maybe change of attitude. Some metrics on that.
I'm sorry, so what's exactly the question?
So if ACE plans to consider metrics on change of attitudes, for example, or movement buildings?
Sure. I definitely think movement building is really important. I think it's another thing that's hard to quantify, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I think there's some organizations out there that are taking efforts to try and increase the number of advocates as a strategic approach to animal advocacy, and I think that's a really important thing, but there's a lot of factors that are tough to examine about that. So I think even with determining the number of vegetarians and vegans in the population in the United States, we seem to get different numbers every now and then depending on who's conducting polls, and I don't know how certain we are even with that. So unfortunately, I don't have good data to give you on that, but I agree it's an important thing that we'd like to know.
Hi, I'm Kelsey. I'm with Mercy for Animals. Just a quick clarifying question. When you had 10 trillion wild animals listed, did that include aquatic animals and fish?
So not fish, but it did include aquatic. So the estimates are, I actually looked this up because Peter Singer asked me about this last night, so I went home and double-checked my numbers. So 10 trillion is very much a kind of a placeholder estimate because we're so uncertain. So the estimates out there for example, amphibians might be between 1 and 10 trillion. And for birds, I think it was like 200 to 600 billion, right? So there's kind of these wide ranges, and 10 trillion was like a middle ground for all that, but it does include aquatic, but not fish.
Hi, I'm Sharon with Animal Equality. I have a question and a doubt about neglectedness. I just have the impression that it kind of is contrary to impact, because who cares how many people are dedicated to a cause if it's the most important cause? And I think as we move forward, if we put too much stress on neglectedness, we may have that farmed animals and wild animal suffering are things that people are starting to be dedicated to, and then they think, well, maybe this is not as important because it's not a neglected cause anymore. So that's a doubt of mine. I'd love to know your opinions.
Yeah, I think that's a real concern. I guess that would be a good problem to have, right? So if we get to a point where we've got so many people or so much money going towards a cause, then maybe it's not as neglected. I think that's the reason it's one of 3 factors instead of the sole factor. So you still have scale, you still have tractability, and that's why we tried to balance it out with those other things. So I mean, that's a really good point. I don't think we're at a point with at least farmed animals that we have to worry about it, but it's a good point.
But if I can add, I think you have to think about what really matters here, and in a way, neglectedness is standing in for how much of a marginal difference will I make, and that's what it seems to me to be important. So a cause might be the fact that a cause is neglected might mean, well, there's nobody really working on this. You know, in fact, I think of my own contribution to the animal movement when I started thinking about this in 1971. As like that, you know, it wasn't that I thought the animal movement is more important than the Vietnam War, let's say, which was going on. But there was a huge amount of protest and attention being given to the Vietnam War. And there was really just about nobody trying to make the kind of arguments that I was making about animals. So it was a very neglected cause, and it was worth my putting the time into it because I could make a difference. And I think I would have made, you know, no or in very, very small difference to adding my voice to protest against the Vietnam War. So I think that's what you need to think about. And it might be that issues are really big and really important and they're not neglected, but still you have something specific that is important that you can add to it. And then certainly you should. So I regard it as just an indicator, not the last thing in itself of how big a marginal difference you're going to make by putting your effort, your money, time, whatever it might be, into this cause.
Hi, Georgia Mason, University of Guelph. Do you think the general public is more comfortable condemning welfare problems in other cultures than it is welfare problems in its own culture? So, for example, biofarming is obviously awful, bullfighting is obviously awful. And if that's the case, is there a way to refocus their lens back home?
Well, I think that's a good point, and I agree with it. I also think that people tend to want to support things that are close to home. They want to support their local communities. So I think maybe we could balance that problem with the desire of many people to support things that are local or in their own country.
Yeah, but I agree. I think we ought to be making people more aware of what's going on in their own country. And this was, again, more of an issue, I thought, when I first became involved in this. I was living in England, and there were big campaigns against bullfighting. There were a lot of publicity, because a lot of English tourists were going to Spain. So they were saying, don't go to the bullfight, not even just once, that's all it needs to keep going. There was a lot of effort into that. And, fine, obviously bullfighting is horrible, but I thought compared to the fact that all of this factory farming was going on in England, it was an absurd amount of attention for a relatively small number of bulls. So I do think you need to tell people, look, fine, protest against things that are far away, but really think about what you can change, what's going on right here, and that's worth more attention.
Hi, Bonnie Wiper from Thinking Animals. My question is, do you know of any organizations or efforts to bring together people who are working with wild animals, in other words, conservationists and biologists, with people that are working with farm animals to create some kind of unified voice? Or is that even, do you see that as even possible? Since everybody's, of course, working for animals.
I mean, conservationists are becoming more aware of the impact of the meat industry on climate change. So I think we are working together on that issue. It's been a little slow. If you've seen the documentary Cowspiracy, you'll see how reluctant some of the big conservation organisations have been to directly tackle meat because their members are mostly not vegetarian. But I think we're starting to improve, and I think we need to keep doing that. But on other conservation issues, it's harder, and I guess it's, with farm animals cause a lot of pollution, a lot of other things as well. You can do that. But conservationists tend to have other interests in biodiversity in particular, which is a distinct value from an interest in the well-being of the particular animals. And there are obviously potential clashes. They may want to kill feral animals, even when they can only be killed in quite cruel and painful ways. So there are potential value conflicts that I think are genuine, can't really be avoided.
I'm just going to do these last two quick questions and then we'll figure out time.
Hi, Maureen Cohen-Harrington, Congressional Vegetarian Staff Association. I'm wondering if your group is addressing or thinking of addressing the problem of human overpopulation, because that affects every one of the animal groups that you've discussed, including factory farm animals, as well as the environment and climate change, which in turn affects all of the animal groups that you've discussed. And I've noticed a big reluctance in the animal rights community and also in the environmental community to take that problem on head on.
Well, I would say to that end, to kind of tie it to the last question, I think the intersectionality of movements should be explored whenever possible. I think that makes us all bigger and stronger. But unfortunately, a lot of people in different movements have strong values, and it is hard sometimes to combine those. I think with kind of vegetarian advocacy, for example, we're asking people to examine very personal decisions that they make 3 times a day about what they eat or what they wear. And sometimes that's not as palatable as a message to other movements. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. We don't have plans to examine that specific component right now. It doesn't mean we won't in the future. I think it is important, and I think the environmental movement is important as well. In terms of wild animal suffering, for example, the status of the environment could very well affect how many animals are out there suffering, so that's something we should care about. But right now, I think we've tended to focus more in the animal realm to kind of shore up what we know about that, to feel more confident about it, and because of some of those challenges I referenced about the strong views that people in other movements might have that might not coincide with the animal movement.
Yeah, I just want to say I do think it's an important issue, but it's also quite a delicate one because it's very easy to be in a position of we in the basically white world who have relatively lower population growth rates are telling other people, Africans in particular, that they need to stop reproducing, and that's clearly a sensitive thing to do. So I don't disagree with you that population growth is behind a lot of problems. It needs to be handled carefully, and it is to some extent, a separate issue as well. Clearly, it underlies a lot of the problems, but it also has its own agenda, as the animal movement has its own agenda.
Hi, Paul Shapiro with the Humane Society of the United States. Thank you both for your excellent talks. You both made a compelling point about why the movement ought to be focused more on farm animals than it is. I'm wondering if within that, whether you two have thoughts on what is the most effective thing we can do for farm animals, both within the animal advocacy world, and then also whether you think that which may be more effective, working to advance the interests of farm animals or working on technologies that could obviate the need for farm animals?
Well, my response would be that the technology is one of the best ways to advocate for animals. So the things I would say I'm most excited about are things that cause sweeping change, right? Corporate outreach campaigns, I think institutional campaigns, Meatless Monday campaigns, where you're able to convince entire school districts to go meatless on Monday, resulting in hundreds of thousands of meatless meals every single week. Not to mention the fact that you're bringing up the issue to children at a young age. They have to think about that, which is something that I never thought about until I was in my early 20s. So I think there's a lot of value to those, and I also think there's a ton of value in the growing tech industry. I think organizations that are doing work to produce foods that are going to be able to address kind of the biggest barriers, which to me and to others seem to be cost, convenience, and taste. So if you can manage to overcome those hurdles, make plant-based alternatives or cultured meat, clean meat alternatives readily available, and you're able to get them out in the market cheaply, and they're going to be healthier for you. I mean, these are all things that are going to motivate people to make that change that is going to be in their best interests, not necessarily in the interests of the animals, which, of course, we often want to just serve our own interests. So I think those two things are interlocked. But I do want to give a call out, even though I do value those as the ways to create the biggest amount of change. As I spoke in my presentation, I think the grassroots outreach efforts are really pivotal as well. We can't just give up on that. You do need a well-rounded approach. You do need to rally cry the public to think critically about these issues, to get out there and support the campaigns to make these big changes, to go out and support the initial stages of clean meat or plant-based alternatives, because they're not going to be cost-effective at the beginning, and they're going to need that public support. So I do think it really is a complementary approach is going to be most successful.
And I really agree with that. I think the technology idea is really exciting. If we can get things that appeal to people in the same way that meat does, and if we can make it economic, healthy, nutritious, and so on, that could be fantastic and could have huge potential. But I do think we also need to continue to change people's attitudes, because after all, even if the meat and farm animal issue is by far the biggest, it's not the only one. I think we do want to build a society in which people have better attitudes to animals and more opposition to cruelty to animals. That'll become easier if people are not dependent on eating meat, because I think the fact that people eat meat makes them discount the interests of animals because they somehow, even if subconsciously, realize that if they thought that animal interests count equally, they wouldn't be eating meat. So making it easier for them to be vegetarian will help in both ways. But I think it's important to continue changing attitudes. It's important to continue making ethical arguments. It's important to continue the corporate outreach and changing consumer attitudes. And where possible, it's important to continue with legislative initiatives as well.
Great, so thank you all so much. Let's get one more big round of applause for